Welcome to MSI's Lunch Lecture. I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. One of the most popular is our Lunch Lectures at MSI webinar series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as media, pharmaceuticals, transportation, CPG, as well as MSI members such as Daiichi Sankyo, Comcast, Colgate, Miller Coors, and more. We're delighted to welcome you to learn more about marketing strategies for emerging markets. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point out the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Jagdish Sheth is Charles H. Kelstadt Chair in the Marketing at Emory University's Goizueta Business School. Prior to coming to Emory, he had chaired positions at the University of Southern California, the University of Illinois, Columbia University, and MIT. Jag has published more than 350 research papers and books on a variety of topics. He is a past president of the Association of Consumer Research, a fellow of the American Marketing Association, and a distinguished fellow of the Academy of Marketing Science. He's won many outstanding educator awards, and he's the recipient of all four of the top academic awards bestowed by the American Marketing Association for his work in areas such as marketing, consumer behavior, and emerging markets. And that will be his topic today as he shares with us how to succeed in emerging markets. So thanks very much, Chef. Go ahead.
Thank you, Earl. I'm so glad to do the webinar. This is a topic that is gaining momentum in all over the world because as mature economies are struggling for domestic growth, they are looking internationally, and the only markets available for future growth are emerging markets. So the title of my presentation is How to Succeed in Emerging Markets. My first slide actually is the fundamental shift in global growth. It basically tells you that compared to the last century, this century has a fundamental two-dimensional shift from mature markets, which are all advanced countries, about 15, 20 of them, OECD countries as they're called. The growth is going to come more and more from emerging markets. China is an obvious example. India is rising. Indonesia the same way. But the key other dimension that is very important for us to understand is that we all know about marketing knowledge from branded competition, where one branded product competes with another branded, like in the CPG space, consumer product, packaged goods, for example. You will have Unilever competing with Nestle, or you might have Procter & Gamble here competing with somebody else in the same space. They're all branded competition, whereas in the emerging markets, the biggest competition is the unbranded competition. My estimates are running that as much as 65% of all consumption in emerging markets even today is unbranded products and services. Services would be almost 90%. So we have to really understand more the unbranded competition as we go toward the emerging markets. If you look at the why emerging markets are growing, which is the next page, you will see emerging markets are growing because of four main reasons. I'm sure there are more reasons, but these are the four that I have found to be very critical based upon my research. Biggest reason is on the upper right-hand side, aging of affluent nations. All affluent nations are aging and aging much more rapidly than the demographers ever expected or forecasted even. Japan, for example, is a negative population growth. There will be fewer men next month than this month, for example, in Japan because they have no growth whatsoever. Germany is equal between population growth and population death, for example. The death and the birth count is about the same. U.S. is still growing a little, but at a much lower place than the replacement cycle of 2.1, and therefore that's a very key problem. So aging of the emerging advanced economies is a very key aspect. Our second area is rise of the new brand-conscious middle class. If you go back to the previous slides, you will find that rise of the new middle class. In all of these emerging markets, they all want to now consume branded products, which is a key change that's taking place. I call it the new middle class. It's true in Africa, for example, definitely true in India, Latin America, any place you go, you can get the feel people want branded products and services, not just the T-shirts and the jeans, but also, in fact, flour, wheat, anything that we can consume at home. Most of the emerging markets were locked in by protecting the existing status quo. Economic reforms have come. More and more they are becoming open markets. Competition is allowed both domestically and internationally, which is creating unlocking of the potential. And the last one and the most important one is that we have a huge amount of affordable innovations. I call it the democratization of innovations, especially the digital products, like the cell phones, for example, the internet, for example. All of those are becoming very affordable. Masses actually are able to consume those, and they have access and affordability. Both are coming together. So these are the four key drivers. The data clearly shows you on page number 4, the next page. You can clearly see in the data. Based upon the purchasing power parity measure that was really created in the 90s to show the potential of these economies. If you count the exchange rate, then because of the dollar being so high priced, most of them do not look that good as a calculation of the GDP. So governments have decided to come out with a new measure called purchasing power parity, which means a market basket of goods. In the local currency, what is your buying power? So many of the emerging economies like China, for example, and India, it's about 1/3 really is the ratio, about 3 times. That's clearly very fascinating. So around here you can clearly see China is under the PPP measure. The GDP calculated by World Bank is already beyond, in fact, above United States, $23.3 trillion. U.S. is the next one now, 19.3, but India is coming up very large now, third largest economy, 9.4 trillion. And by the way, in the typical GDP measure, India just surpassed France. That's the traditional measure. I think this is very key to find. And you can see basically that among the top 10 economies, more than 5 are emerging economies, and they are growing much faster than obviously the traditional advanced economies, from where we have got most of the marketing knowledge. On the next page, you will see a book called Chindia Rising. And Chindia Rising is a book I wrote several years ago. And the reason I wrote it primarily to show that the new triad power, the old triad power used to be Japan on the one hand, Western Europe in 12 countries, and United States, they control most of the economic activity. Now it is shifting to the new triad power, United States number 1 still in terms of the traditional GDP, China and India. And China and India combined together will become the largest consumer markets. There is a book by Boston Consulting Group called The $10 Trillion Consumer Economy. I think it's a very good book and has done a lot of research in these 2 markets. So this is following the research, following the book that I wrote pretty much, which I think is fascinating. So on the next page, page 6, you will see some numbers. The consumer revolution in China and India. By 2020, there will be nearly 1 billion middle-class consumers in China and India. Consumer spending will triple, reaching $6.2 trillion a year in China. This is in PPP measures, and $3.6 trillion in India. It's about 2/3, 1/3 ratio between these 2 nations. The $10 trillion market by 2020 will be the largest consumer market in the world. And we have already seen this thing. China is now number 1 in automobiles, number 1 in cell phones. India is number 2 in cell phones. And I remember my research on cellular telephone technology in 1983 to 85 when we were commercializing from Bell Labs and AT&T. All the experts' forecast was that there will be no more than 950,000 cellular subscribers by the year 2000, and of course we are off by a few billion. Nobody anticipated China will be the biggest market. And now we have the e-commerce platforms that have come in. So Alibaba is as big as Amazon, for example. Tencent is as big as Alibaba, and they're growing much in a different way. So we need to watch the e-commerce impact in both India and in China. So on page 7, you can clearly see the Chinese born in 2019 will consume 38 times more than those born in 1960. Think about where the consumption is taking place. Indian born in 2009 will consume 13 times more than those born in 1960. The difference is primarily because India was already privatized under the British rule. It was not a communist nation and therefore had a mixed economy. And hence the bump about 13 times is not as great as 38 times in China, where there was such a shortage of everything by and large. Next page, you can see by 2015, the Chinese will be the biggest e-shoppers in the world. These numbers, by the way, have already become obsolete, I must tell you. There will be 356 million Chinese shopping online. I think it is now about 500 million people, and it's growing much faster. In 2020, China will be the top luxury market in the world. It is now already the top. Any luxury brand, China is the biggest market, surpassed America, and the numbers are underestimating right now. These numbers are growing every day. It's very hard to keep them up unless we do a real-time presentation of the numbers themselves. Next slide. Again, some more data. Slide number 9. By 2015, India will have more than 800 million cell phone subscribers. And by the way, they just about have reached that number already. More importantly, in India, the government has done a biometric identification of all of their citizens, and that database is more than 1 billion people. It is very sophisticated, and now it's called Aadhaar as a platform. It is used to distribute all of the, public assistance programs like food stamps, natural gas, whatever it is. And now the government is seriously thinking that they have a database which is more secure. Can we use that for some commercial purposes? In other words, it's more secure than our social security system. It just goes on and on. So again, you can see the numbers around here, which I will not belabor pretty much, like the home loan market in India. Next page, please. Given this potential, why most multinationals fail in emerging markets? The failure record is enormous. And what I've done to identify 6 reasons why, as multinationals go into emerging markets, tend to have some headwinds or have some problems, and the failure rate is very high. The exceptions might be companies like Colgate, for example, or in the newer digital technologies like the personal computers or cell phones, digital technologies, home electronics, like the television sets, the success is a little better. But in the traditional home products, including furniture, including appliances, definitely foods and beverages, here are the reasons. The first reason I find is that most of us extend our practices and processes into emerging markets where they are very different in terms of their infrastructure, very different in terms of their financial capabilities, chronic shortage of resources, etc. So that's clearly one factor. Most of the multinationals, they focus on branded competitors. So P&G thinks Unilever is their competitor in India. Coke thinks Pepsi is their competitor, for example. And this is where they blindside themselves because, as I mentioned earlier, the real competition comes from unbranded competitors. These are white label computers, surprisingly. White label luggage, for example, totally unbranded, made like a handicraft, and every small market, and especially in foods and beverages, it is really as small as a small town. Street vendors, we can imagine all of them, they are the biggest competitors, and we don't understand how they compete or what is their competitive advantage. Third reason is that most multinationals target only the upper socioeconomic classes, or what I call affluent metro markets, which is less than 10% of the population. And often they don't have enough density in any one market So they spread out over the country rather than go one city or two cities, and they don't see the economics. Number 4, they do not understand socio-political governance mechanism. This is very key. The markets in emerging markets, access is controlled by political, socio institutions. The biggest one of them is faith. Faith matters a lot. And these faiths are not Christian faiths. In many of these emerging markets, either they are faith agnostic, like in communism, for example, or they have other faiths who have gatekeeping mechanisms. And we don't understand that, and that I find as a very key area. In many cases, you do have the ghetto markets, like Dharavi in Bombay is a very large market of consumers, but it is controlled by what we would call mafia elements. Basically, there are gatekeepers, merchants, as well as the financing people who control these markets, and they do not allow access to foreign-made, foreign-branded products into their markets. Number 5, they are unable to manage local supply chain. This is a very key factor. In most of these cases, supply chain, it becomes a very key issue, and that's not organized. Fortunately, with the e-commerce platforms now in emerging markets, supply chain is getting organized. In many countries, by the way, from the producer to the consumer, there may be as many 8-9 middlemen. Very inefficient system. So one needs to make it more efficient through technology rather than promote the same way as they've been doing business before. And last one is that unfortunately these markets do require longer term commitment. And therefore the traditional approach to financial measurements with which we evaluate these markets is not as practical or is not as appropriate. So these are the reasons why most of the failures happen in emerging markets. And I have now on the next slide recommendations about different strategies. The first major strategy, as you can see, is convert unbranded to branded consumption. That's very simple. It's very doable because that's exactly what we did in America 100 years ago. When we shifted from the agriculture to the industrial society, we began to brand products, and people began to buy, or consumers began to buy branded products. We branded soap, for example, or we branded shampoo eventually. We branded appliances, just went on and on. And if you look at the washing machines before, let's say Whirlpool of the world or General Electric came, it was the same scenario. So this is like 100 years look back of what happened in America and maybe earlier than in Europe. I think you see the same feel around here. So if you go to these are the 10 basic strategies I'm recommending. I will go with each one of them in some depth on the following pages. So page 12, I'm going to talk about how converting unbranded to branded consumption. And the best example I can give you is Colgate toothpaste. Colgate has done a remarkable job all over the world. It is the dominant brand. Remember, before toothpaste, there was a tooth powder. Before that one, people used baking soda on the one hand, or just, in fact, bricks and making paste or a powder out of the brick and brushing it by hand, literally. Colgate invented the toothbrush, toothpaste, and it dominates the world no matter where they go. There is a Santur soap, is a company in India. I wanted to give you examples other than just the American examples or the European examples. Santur soap has gone after the rural market. This is a company that began with vegetable fat. While the affluent people could afford something like a Crisco or a Unilever brand called Dalda in India, Santur began to go into the fatty acids essentially, or the lard, but vegetable lard in this case, and they began to offer to the masses through the street vendors. Then they took, in fact, the hydrogenated oil and converted into the soap. Today it is number 1 soap in the rural India market, which is again a remarkable feat. Number 2 strategy is convert non-users to users. Many people have homemade products. How do you motivate them to buy commercially? It's a make versus buy decision now, as opposed to whatever they are consuming, unbranded to branded, which is the first. This is the second recommendation. And around here, cosmetics is a very key example. cosmetics, everybody would like to beautify. There's a universal need worldwide, especially among women, but women and men, among all human beings. We like to beautify, we like to differentiate. Now we make it more a commercial one. Medicine is something that people are going through right now. Chinese have a traditional herbal medicine. They believe in that medicine, but with more education and more modernization and more modern lifestyle, in many ways, younger people are now buying more allopathy medicine, branded medicine, prescription or over-the-counter. Shampoo and personal care, the same thing. And I wanted to use some service examples. And again, many of these emerging markets had no life insurance, like in the advanced countries. But today, life insurance has become a big business. In fact, the best life insurance company in terms of going after lower socioeconomic classes and increasing affordability and accessibility probably would be a company in India called Life Insurance Corporation of India, LIC, which has done more innovation than anything I have seen in advanced countries, different life insurance companies. Number 3 strategy on the next page. I think this is very key. Can we develop used markets? Unfortunately, most of our marketing knowledge has come from packaged goods industries. Pearson Soap was the first one in England. Procter & Gamble was the second one here. They're all consumable products. But the consumers consume intermediate like clothing, for example, or they consume durable appliances, automobiles, motorcycles, cell phones. There is a huge used market, and I think marketers have never thought about creating used markets. In very high capital goods like automobiles or motorcycles, homes, we do that thing. But used market is true for television sets. It's true for many product categories we have not thought about. So consciously, how can we develop a used market itself? As IBM did surprisingly in mainframe computers, because mainframes would have 15 years of life, but surprisingly, people will replace it in 5 years because new technology was coming. There will be a trade-in allowance just like in the automobile, and IBM actually created a whole new company, separate independent one, that sold nothing but used IBM 360 machines, 7070, the old models at one time, which is, I think, very possible in used markets. In fact, if you go to Mexico, for example, or Cuba as emerging markets, many of the used products are smuggled into those countries. Automobile is a key example. So it's very much out there, but it has to be done in an organized, systematic way. Number 4 strategy is very interesting. I find that brands have life cycles. Products may not have life cycles. In the Western world, because we got organized around Industrial Revolution, patent rights, so we offer premium product first, high-priced, high-quality, high-performance. Then to grow, we become more value, which means best value, and then ultimately we compete on price. As the differentiation goes away, we become a commodity. In emerging markets, the reverse strategy is much better, where one starts with a lower price point with only acceptable quality, improves the quality while keeping the price low. It becomes a value brand now, and ultimately you offer a premium brand. This is what Toyota, Nissan, and Honda did in America, for example. The premium brands were locked out as a market by Cadillac or Continental. The best value was Chevrolet or Ford. So they entered at a lower price point, no frill product like Toyota Corolla, which became number 1 seller at one time all over the world. Then they improved that to the family sedan called Camry, and of course they came into the luxury market, Lexus. I think reverse brand life cycle is a very key strategy to succeed in emerging markets, which is not the way generally well-known multinationals think. Next page, I'm talking about strategy number 5. This is very easy. Repackage to make the product more affordable. Surprisingly, some of these examples come from the old days, like ITC is a major cigarette company in India. Used to be Imperial Tobacco, became Indian Tobacco, now just call it ITC. They found that cigarette package with maybe 8, 12 sticks inside is too expensive. So they began to sell individual stick, because a farmer in rural market has a local tobacco, is called BD in India, for example, BEEDI. And very fascinating, they began to take that market away, which is do-it-yourself, homemade, or unbranded, into a branded cigarette, and they succeeded very well. So did Brook Bond Tea at one time by creating 500,000 agents who will go to any part of India on a bicycle or by walking as a last-mile problem in many ways. And you have seen more recently Coca-Cola, to succeed in India, came out with a can smaller in size and by dropping the unit price. And of course, the biggest success, again, began in India, is single-use sachet shampoos. Began by an entrepreneur who found that the rural population would like to use shampoo, but there is no running water, there is no multiple-use possibility even. The product may not be stored properly, and the unit price is too high, and therefore they began to make the same shampoo in a single sachet, single use. Actually, it is more margin product than when you buy in a bottle, for example. I did research similarly on the failure of chiclets in India many, many years ago. And I found the reason was that the chiclet was the same 8 units in a package. It was too expensive. More importantly, it only had a cellophane wrap, which in India with hot and humid, you put it in your pocket, it melts. So we redesigned the cellophane to something much more durable, more weatherproof, but more importantly, offered in a unit of 2. So affordability came very quickly by repackaging the whole thing. So repackaging is my very favorite, like reverse brand life cycle, as a way of getting into the mass market in emerging markets. Point number 6, financing the low-income consumers. There's a whole system of financing what I call low-income consumers. By the way, I'm doing research in this area now on a worldwide basis, and I find fascinating that low income as defined by, let's say, World Bank and IMF, $2 per day income, United Nations does the same, below the poverty level, the worldwide market is $5 trillion. They consume, but they consume unbranded products or consume local branded, and they're financed, so there's a huge financing industry. In India, it is called the chit system. These are all entrepreneurs and create a peer group financing mechanism. And of course, better known in the Western world is called micro-lending. These are now becoming legitimate institutions for lending money. Governments are trying to co-opt them to become more like organized, regulated industries as opposed to unorganized by and large. So financing low-income consumers, especially for durable products where the unit price is very high, or a monthly payment. And I must take a couple of minutes away from presentation. I don't know, but if you know emerging markets, you will see that trader in a local neighborhood has a multi-generational relationship. The trader actually will finance a monthly consumer family because they have not got their paycheck or the cash payment. It transcends generations. There will be a delivery boy who comes and says, what do you need today? I'll bring it from the store, all the things that you need, whether those are shampoos, detergents, whatever the kind of family needs, and he or she will deliver essentially. That system now is becoming more organized retailing, but the financing is a very key component. Let's go to the next slide, point number 7. Invent new ways to distribute the product. I think here the best advantage is going to come from e-commerce companies. That's very important. And in countries like India and China, you have seen Flipkart in India, which is just sold to Walmart for $16 billion. Flipkart began like Amazon, primarily offering online book distribution, and they've now offered everything just like Amazon. They're almost a copy of Amazon. Alibaba that I mentioned earlier in China, same thing. That's very key. But I find that in many of these countries, deep into the rural population, NGOs are very present. These NGOs are faith-based NGOs or basically just NGOs serving the society, and that's where NGOs can act as your distributors. They actually can store your products over there. They have an inventory management, and they Public, they trust the NGOs. Medicine people are doing it quite a lot to distribute their medical, let's say prescription medicines even through the NGO channels. And the last area I recommend is bazaars and festivals. Again, examples will come more from India because I come from India, but you see this in Mexico, you see this in Brazil, you see this in Latin America. There are always festivals or county fairs in America. Those are very good one-time event happening again and again, become a great marketplace. It's a bazaar. You get together there regularly. Buyers and sellers come, not just for farmers' products or farmers' markets, but also for durable appliances, consumer electronics, for everything. Point number 8, eighth strategy. Develop aspirational brands. I call them aspirational brands. And in emerging markets, aspirations come from two sources, maybe different than what we have learned in the advanced economies. The faith is a great, great ambassador or a marketer. Many of these emerging economy consumers are very faith-based centric. They believe in the faith, the God, the goddesses, whatever they are. If one can create an aspirational brand around a faith or a spirituality in some fashion, it seems to take off. The best example I find is a company in India called Patanjali, started by a spiritual leader called Baba Ramdev. He is basically a yoga teacher, has multi-million people following. Out of nowhere, he goes back to the traditional medicine called Ayurveda, which is a herbal medicine for most of the diseases. All of the marketing was basically unbranded products, local distribution, very, I would say, unorganized distribution. He suddenly branded it, organized it, and has now become almost rival to Unilever in terms of revenues, which took about 75 years for Unilever in India to come up to that level, and is growing strong. Patanjali brand is likely to surpass some of the largest multinational brands in India and similarly in other countries. They are going global. They are using e-commerce platforms, but the faith is a very key factor. Other than faith, the second most important thing is celebrities, especially celebrities around movies, but nowadays more and more celebrity around sports. So in India, cricket is the one. China may be basketball, for example. The soccer or football, as the rest of the world calls, is all over the world. World Cup is a very key event in Latin America. They're passionate. If the brand can create aspirations by linking to the faith or to celebrities, it seems to do very well. Second major aspect is word-of-mouth communication and influencers. In many of these markets, like historically we found out in the rural market in America, farmers trust more wealthy, more well-established other farmers, opinion leaders, as we used to call them. There was a gentleman, Everett Rogers, who created the whole theory of diffusion of innovation. All that literature is very relevant in emerging markets. Except word of mouth today, and influencers in these emerging markets have leapfrogged the whole PC revolution. It is all now on mobile platforms or social media. So one can leverage word of mouth and influencers on social media, and they can actually promote aspirational branding. That, I think, is the 8th strategy. Next page, strategy number 9. Again, the two key issues in emerging markets are affordability and accessibility. So can we create low-cost, affordable innovations? It's already done. If you go to many of the emerging markets, proprietary brands, they have come out with generics. China leads in this area, so does India. These generics will be the same as prescription drugs, prescribed, but the prices would be 1/3 to 1/5 cheaper to make them affordable. In fact, one has to go into countries like India, where you will find that the cost of the same medication would be about, I would say, 10% of the cost what we pay in advanced economies. And companies like General Electric, Philips, all of these medical device makers are now learning how to make low-cost, affordable innovations for electrocardiograms, for example, blood pressure technologies, and most of these places have no running water or electricity for that matter, so they're making them portable, and that innovation, surprisingly, in emerging markets is also becoming what we call a reverse innovation. You invent there and market in advanced countries because there's a whole segment of consumers, even in advanced countries, who can't afford that. So you make them more affordable by reversing the flow from emerging markets to advanced countries. And the last recommendation or the last strategy is very simple: educate, educate, educate. That means these markets will not be there waiting for you to spring up. Either you can be a fast follower of a local brand that has suddenly realized the right formula and you copy them. That's possible. Or you have to invest in them more like a mission approach. It'll take time. You can't convert them to the branded consumption, especially for foods and beverages, because they are anchored to social norms, faith-based norms. It's a lot of innovation resistance takes place. So I call it, in this case, you have to have very different set of financial measures, mission-driven measurements, not the traditional, how much am I growing my revenue, what is my market share, what's my margin. I think you have to make a long-term commitment. And I think it has to do with the perception more than anything else. There's a very famous saying in my younger days when I was a student, when I taught early in the 60s, international marketing, we always used to use this example of a Bata shoes, B-A-T-A. They come from the Eastern European country. They sent somebody in the early 1900s to Africa, some sales business development person. He went there and saw everybody was bare feet. And he came back and says, people wear no shoes, therefore there is no market. After a few years, he sent another business development sales guy who goes to Africa, Sub-Sahara. He says, everybody is bare feet, what a great market opportunity. I think it's that perception. It is that mindset that makes all the difference about emerging markets. And one of the biggest things that I find in my advising consulting role or in my lectures, that we all have colonial mindset about emerging markets. It comes through our body language even, not just the way we advertise, not the way we communicate the brand, the way we design the brand, and the market sees through. What they want is a brand that is localized to their design, their preferences, their ingredients, which is a very different strategy. So I do believe colonial mindset comes in the way quite often about the opportunity in these emerging markets, and therefore you cannot have the traditional measurements. Long-term commitments are absolutely essential here. And we used to think about at one time, remember, think global, act global. Ted Levitt was the one who articulated globalization of markets. Then we came out with a slogan, think global, act local. We call it glocal. Then we came out with the idea that maybe we have to think about local. So I have a new area that's very fascinating, think local, act global. In other words, markets are highly local actually, with strong cultural differences. You can create multiple brands therefore, and a brand that is a street vendor product, a snack item, in a country like India, China, Brazil, everybody has a snack item. Can you package that, create quality assurance, but take it worldwide? People are very curious about other cultural consumption objects. So having a local focus becomes very, very key. So let me conclude. Last page is my conclusion, page 17. There are at least 10 marketing strategies for emerging markets. They range from converting unbranded consumption to branded consumption and converting non-users to users. These are two very key platform strategies. Developing used markets for durable products such as cell phones and motorcycles is very viable. In fact, it is done by the unorganized sector. Marketing to low-income consumers also includes repackaging for affordability, new ways to access the market, the NGO approach, which is brick and mortar, or e-commerce approach, like the Flipkart, Alibaba that we talked about, which are all becoming marketplace people, market makers essentially. Anybody can supply through them, bypassing the traditional channels of distribution, and also developing aspirational brands such as Patanjali that I talked about. What matters most is long-term commitment and a separate driven measures. Unless we do this thing, there will be more and more failures in the emerging markets despite the huge opportunity out there. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. That was great. A lot of good ideas, very well presented, well organized. I'm sure folks will want to go back to this again and again. And this webinar will be archived on our website for those of you who are with us now, and if you want to share it with your colleagues who couldn't make it today. We do have a few questions. I want to remind the audience again that you can use the chat with presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen to submit questions. One question that came in from Saeed, actually it's sort of a two-part question. Are there other examples? You have done most of your work, and the examples you cited were from China and India, but what other markets would you point to perhaps as emerging markets? And based on your research, would you expect the sort of sequence and some of the advice you've given to be pretty much the same for these other markets? Or are there reasons to think that there might be differences in that sort of next tier of emerging markets?
Sure. The first question answer is very simple. Right after China and India, the biggest market growth-wise would be Africa. I have a whole presentation on African awakening. There are 1 billion people all want to be branded product consumers from the traditional way they consume the products. So Africa is the next excitement. Will begin in about a decade. We'll talk about Africa as China becomes more mature economy and becomes very much like the Western economy. As India becomes more mature economy, Africa would be the one that I would clearly think about. Latin America, there are pockets of growth, mostly Central America. Brazil is almost mid-income nation, as economists will call it. Malaysia is mid-income nation. So Africa clearly would be one. My next recommendation would be Indonesia. Out of nowhere, on a purchasing power parity, Indonesia probably would be the 4th or the 5th nation on that World Bank data that I showed you. It is rising much faster than people realized, and that is a huge population base, and they want to become modern. These are all consumer products, but ultimate consumer economy is the one why these economies are growing. It's not the industrial. Industry is a derived product, not the government economy by and large, and therefore we have to watch the consumer market. So that's the first answer. The strategies will be the same, surprisingly, except your competition will be different. Each one has a highly unorganized competition and highly unbranded competitors. The street vendors, for example, in Kenya will not be the same as in, let's say, Nigeria or as in South Africa, and they're definitely not going to be the same as in India or China. So which is why I'm saying the main items that we need to focus from one emerging market to the other is to understand unbranded competition and how do you make unbranded products become branded consumption with quality assurance, economies of scale, whatever we do. And the second part is that how do we make people who are not users of a product become users? Let me add, Ray, one more point. I think it's going to happen faster with digital products than with packaged goods. We need to learn from digital product marketers, such as the cell phone people, like the Xiaomi of the world, or Huawei out of China. They're going global. I think consumer electronics. One can think about the tablets, PC, etc. That's where I think you will see globalization happening. What was Ted Levitt's comment in 1983, where he saw globalization of markets because products were getting standardized across boundaries. Standards were becoming common, which I think is going to happen in the internet age.
Thanks, Jack. That's great. There are a couple of questions I think that relate to one of your points, and that is implicitly at least the advantages that companies emerging from emerging markets might have over multinationals. To your point about the colonial mindset, we usually think about diffusion from the West into these emerging markets. But as you know very well, in fact, there have been technological and other kind of developments, especially kind of the, as you were saying, the generic drugs and medical devices and things coming back from these markets. So maybe just a couple of comments looking the other way, the advantages that emerging market companies may have operating globally over current multinationals.
Yes, absolutely true. In fact, I just prepared a presentation on that one, which is the global expansion of multinationals from emerging markets. And they come from Mexico, they come from Brazil, they come from, which means Latin America, they come from Africa, surprisingly. And in fact, I'll just give you a punchline right now. Most of these emerging multinationals from emerging markets are coming by three key mechanisms. The first one is through acquisitions. So you see, hire a Chinese brand buys out General Electric in appliances. Or Lenovo, a PC company from China, buys out ThinkPad from IBM, makes a beachhead or a presence here in an advanced country. I think that's a key strategy. Through acquisitions, they have the presence in terms of both market structure, access to market essentially, distribution, and maybe customer base. So that's clearly key. Eventually, they will add their own brands. Our view is that eventually there will be three big players in appliances industry. As an example, obviously Ericsson, the brand from Sweden is very big. For example, General Electric has gone out of the business. Whirlpool will survive probably as they go into emerging markets, but the other brand will be higher from China. This is a key pattern I'm seeing again and again across products. So to me, emerging market multinationals in consumer electronics, in cell phones, will take over the market. They have the home turf advantage of the scale and the size, and that gives them huge economies of scale. So it's a matter of time before they will come into the emerging markets. The second strategy is much more interesting. What they are going is they are called the South nations, as we call North-South in economics. These are the developing nations. They are first going to other developing nations, harden the technology, they know how to deal with those markets, and then they come to advanced economies. This is the strategy I saw Huawei Technologies doing, both in fact in telecom infrastructure, which means cell phone gear, for example, for cellular mobile telephone. From China, they went to Africa, South Africa, North Africa, etc. They are coming to India, for example. Eventually, they will come to advanced economies because in advanced economy, there's an entrenched competition, whereas in other emerging economies, there is no local competitor, which means there are no lobbying forces, etc., to slow them down, which is the second major strategy. Third, they're going to invest in their branding. And those brands will use, which is what I call follow the Japanese. Japanese were, as you know, poor quality, cheap goods, people laughed at them. But Japan invested in quality, and today we admire Japanese brands all over the world. Koreans followed that. The next one will be, for example, from South Africa or from Mexico. Grupo Bimbo owns all of the flour mills in America now. Or South African brewing SAB owns Miller Beer, for example. Or, if you take it's a Brazilian brand based in Belgium for whatever reason, they own Anheuser-Busch around here, for example. So it's very interesting to me, in many of the markets, as advanced economies exit them because they become commodities, emerging market multinationals will acquisition and make a beachhead and will come and, of course, invest in their own brands worldwide.
That's great. I think there's a kind of a related question that I also wanted to raise, and Neeraj raises it as well, and that is the implications for some of what you've given us today for the so-called sharing economy. You mentioned one of the strategies to succeed in emerging markets was to develop the used market for pre-owned objects. And as you know, here there's a movement towards sharing, ride-hailing services as opposed to own a car. So this may be another example where what's happening in emerging markets actually has some implications for what's happening in the developed markets. But just your thoughts about the relationship between the used markets in emerging markets and what's happening in terms of the sharing economy.
Very much. Ray, you are so right. There's a huge parallel. There's a high correlation. The key advantage emerging market economies have now is leapfrogging into the cellular telephone architecture. Everybody has a smartphone now. And those smartphones are capable of doing things that we could have never imagined. I can get information, I can do procurement, and I can do fulfillment. So many of these e-commerce companies from emerging economies will come into advanced economies. And I'll give you one dramatic example, and I know we are running for time always at these things, but the next payment platform we went through in America through the credit rating system. We created credit cards, which are very legacy. We now do have a PayPal or Apple Pay, but you know that in Kenya, they have M-Pesa, M-P-E-S-A. 30% of all GDP is done on M-Pesa, which is basically cell phones. You load your money on the cell phones. You don't need any currency. You don't need credit card. They're way far ahead in technology. They are the lead, surprisingly, in the world, meant for, obviously, their own social and government agenda. And it's very fascinating how that technology now comes as a reverse technology in this country or advanced economies. And I talked about this India biometric database of billion people, which is so sophisticated. So far, no hacker has been able to at least breach it. They might have tried it. And now that becomes a platform which, surprisingly, for 1.1 people, it is bigger than Apple platform. So I can have all the app guys come on that platform all over the world. And last comment I will make, and this is very interesting, and I know I'm running for time. Walmart bought Flipkart. The reason you buy Flipkart is not to access Indian market in this case, or you go to China through partnership with Alibaba or somebody, but is to access the suppliers. It's all about supply chain. My estimates are running that today, in about 4 or 5 years, Walmart will create 100,000 new merchants and producers out of India, medium to small size, all pumping their product through Walmart system, not for India, but into Mexico, into Canada, into the US, and surprisingly, eventually into China. Think about that one, made in India product sold in China, because you now have a market maker who is so powerful like a Walmart. And if it happens at Walmart, Amazon will do the same. Amazon has a huge presence in India. And last year, actually, Amazon did that very well. They're taking products from emerging markets and pumping through their e-commerce platforms into advanced countries. So watch e-commerce players. They will transform marketing more than we have realized.